The safeguards were still there. They appeared in policy manuals, unchanged in structure. They were referenced in onboarding materials. They remained embedded in the formal language of oversight, audit, and review. Nothing had been formally dismantled. From the outside, the agency looked intact, perhaps even improved. Its reporting cadence was regular. Its public communications were measured. Leadership spoke consistently about stability, professionalism, and institutional maturity. There was no visible rupture. What had changed was not the architecture of oversight, but how oversight was understood. In stable institutional environments, safeguards are often described as mechanisms, procedural interruptions placed inside workflows to slow momentum, verify assumptions, and force reconsideration. They exist as friction by design. Over time, those same safeguards are frequently reframed as outcomes rather than actions. Oversight becomes something presumed to exist wherever experienced professionals operate. This shift did not occur under pressure. There was no emergency demanding speed, no scandal forcing simplification, no political intervention requiring reform. The environment was calm. That calm became sufficient justification. Before the shift, safeguards were not elegant. They were repetitive. They were procedural. They interrupted work that appeared already complete. A file might be reviewed twice by different units, not because duplication improved outcomes, but because duplication exposed inconsistency. Escalations occurred even when nothing seemed wrong. Questions were raised that most participants assumed had already been answered. This was not because the system distrusted its personnel. It was because the system distrusted its own confidence. Safeguards functioned less as detectors of error than as reminders of uncertainty. They slowed decisions not to correct them, but to make assumptions visible. They were rehearsed constantly, not ceremonially, operationally. Over time, that repetition became indistinguishable from inefficiency. And when nothing visibly failed, the repetition began to appear unnecessary. There was no single decision point, no announcement, no vote, no public declaration. The shift occurred through accumulation. Secondary reviews were reclassified as situational. Escalation thresholds were described as discretionary. Audit intervals were extended incrementally, then extended again. Each change appeared minor. Each was justified through experience. The system had operated reliably across years of relative stability. Senior personnel required less visible verification. Interdepartmental friction appeared to slow response without improving outcomes. Oversight was not removed. Verification was not abolished. It became implicit. Safeguards remained documented. They remained theoretically available. They were no longer rehearsed. No objections were raised. There was nothing explicit to oppose. At first, the system improved. Decision throughput increased. Administrative latency declined. Internal coordination felt smoother. Discretion expanded. Processes felt less encumbered. Audits continued to pass. This was not because nothing had changed. It was because the system had quietly altered what it considered noteworthy. Safeguards that are not exercised do not fail immediately. They lose sharpness. Teams stopped anticipating interruption. Files moved forward without pause. Exceptions became accommodations rather than signals. The safeguards still existed, but they were no longer expected to intervene. What disappeared was not control, but anticipation. As safeguards receded from daily practice, accountability subtly shifted. Earlier, decisions were legitimated through process. Now they were legitimated through alignment. If outcomes matched expectations, scrutiny diminished. If no objections arose internally, approval was assumed. Legitimacy became retrospective rather than procedural. Errors were no longer framed as system failures. They were treated as contextual anomalies. Responsibility diffused, not upward, outward. Safeguards had once concentrated accountability at defined points. Without them, accountability spread thinly across roles, making it harder to locate. Nothing collapsed, but clarity eroded. Externally, the system appeared to strengthen. Requests were routed faster. Responses arrived cleanly. No alarm sounded. Other institutions interpreted speed as competence, consistency as reliability, silence as stability. Trust deepened externally at the same moment internal skepticism declined. This asymmetry mattered later. When stress eventually arrived, it did not produce collapse. It produced delay. Signals emerged slowly. Ambiguities accumulated. Coordination lagged. Safeguards still existed, but activating them now required justification. They slowed workflows, adapted to speed. They questioned assumptions that had become cultural defaults. Oversight had become socially expensive. By the time safeguards were invoked, their function had changed. They no longer prevented risk. They documented it. Later attempts to replicate this posture failed. Other institutions adopted similar language: trust-based oversight, values-driven compliance, reduced redundancy. What they copied was the posture, not the conditions. The original system had relied on stability, low turnover, slow-moving threat environments, professional norms reinforced over decades. Those conditions did not persist. Personnel cycles shortened. Operational environments compressed. Incentives shifted. Trust detached from experience. Trust detached from experience. Safeguards that had once remained dormant could not be reactivated quickly. Their effectiveness depended on rehearsal. Verification is not binary. It degrades gradually. Efforts to restore oversight encountered resistance. Not ideological, but operational. Processes had been unlearned. Roles had blurred. Reintroducing friction now felt punitive rather than protective. Machiavelli treated trust as a tool to be applied selectively. Modern institutions treated it as a substitute for procedure. That distinction changed what decayed. Trust did not fail. It succeeded too completely. The safeguards were never formally removed. They remain documented. They remain referenced. They remain theoretically available. But they no longer sit at the center of the system's attention. Trust did not collapse the institution. It altered what the institution practiced. And what is no longer practiced cannot be relied upon. Even when it still exists, the cost continues. The file is closed anyway.